So South Africa, it's one of those places, isn't it? Always seems to spark a lot of questions, a lot of debate.
Definitely. And we know our listeners are always keen to, you know, dig a bit deeper than the headlines.
Exactly. It feels like a country we think we know the story of, but honestly, the sources we've looked at, especially this transcript featuring Dr. Ernst Rotens, well, it paints a much, much more complicated picture.
Mm-hmm. Far more nuanced.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, really, to tackle that complexity, using the Rhodes transcript as a key source. Forget the easy answers because, frankly, they just don't seem to fit the facts presented.
Yeah, we need to move past that sort of standard Western narrative you often hear.
Right. The one that's basically evil white colonizers displacing peaceful black Africans. Our sources suggest, well, it wasn't nearly that simple.
Not even close.
So the big question for us today is, what are those crucial historical bits, the political nuances that just get constantly overlooked? And maybe more importantly, what could the future hold if these things keep being ignored?
Well, maybe the best place to start is right at the beginning, with the arrival of Europeans.
Okay.
The source highlights that the Dutch East India Company back in 1652 wasn't about some grand conquest initially. Cape Town was meant as a refreshment station.
Ships, right, like a pit stop.
Pretty much. These were Dutch settlers, and then later, Germans and French Huguenots joined them. Dr. Rhodes calls them the Proto-Afrikaners.
Ah, the beginnings of that group.
Exactly. The early European settlers who would eventually become the Afrikaners. But crucially, who was already there.
The Khoi in the sand, right, the Bushmen.
Yes, and they'd been there for an incredibly long time. We're talking tens of thousands of years.
Wow.
Their history in the region is just immense, and genetic studies, interestingly, show they're quite distinct, maybe more related to some Asian groups than to other Black Africans who arrived later.
That's fascinating. So a really ancient and separate lineage.
Definitely underscores the depth here. They were hunter-gatherers living across South Africa, particularly in the more fertile eastern parts.
Okay, so even before major European settlement, you've got this really long, complex history with the Khoi and San, not just one homogeneous group.
Not at all. And then adding another layer, you have Bantu-speaking groups arriving, migrating from the north.
From Central Africa, heading south.
Yeah, and in the process, they were pushing the Khoi and San further south and west.
And Bantu itself just means people, right? The term's a bit controversial now.
It is, but historically it refers to groups like the Zulu, the Xhosa, others we know today, and they tended to be more settled, more agricultural eventually, compared to the nomadic Bushmen.
But initially, all these groups were pre-agricultural.
Initially, yes. So the very early interactions weren't necessarily about, farmers fighting over cultivated fields straight away. That came later.
Right. And this complicates that idea of a peaceful pre-colonial paradise too, doesn't it?
Massively. The source is clear on this. Life for the Bushmen, even before Europeans or major Bantu expansion, wasn't idyllic. Well, tragically, murder seems to have been a common cause of death for men, often from tribal feuds. They even apparently adopted some judicial practices from the Bantu groups to try and settle disputes.
Okay, so right from the start, it's dynamic. Migration, interaction, conflict. It's not a static picture at all.
Absolutely. A far cry from one group just being invaded by another out of the blue. You can already see how this kind of detail challenges the simpler narratives.
Definitely. So let's jump forward a bit. The Europeans arrive, establish the refreshment station, but it didn't stay just about trade, did it?
No. You start seeing the emergence of free burghers.
These were former company employees.
Yeah, people allowed to leave the company's employment and start farming for themselves, settling the land. And inevitably, this led to interactions with the locals, the Khoi and San particularly.
And these interactions were mixed.
Seems so. Both cooperation, trade, exchange, but also conflict. Clashes over land, resources.
It does sound in a way a bit like the early stages of European settlement in North America. That same mix.
There are parallels for sure, and it's important, as the source stresses, not to only focus on the conflict, though it certainly happened, but then things shift again.
With the British.
Exactly. Britain takes control of the Cape Colony around 1810, after the Napoleonic Wars, and this adds a whole new layer of conflict.
But this time between the Europeans themselves.
Yes. Now you have the Dutch-descended Boers increasingly at odds with the new British administration. Rules, language, culture, lots of friction.
Okay, so that internal European tension builds up.
Yeah.
And this leads to the Great Trek.
Precisely. A really pivotal moment for the Afrikaners. In the 1830s, around 2,000 Boers decided they'd had enough of British rule.
They wanted freedom, independence.
That was the driving force, so they packed up their ox wagons and headed into the interior. It's an incredible story.
Again, the source draws that parallel with the American West. Pioneers heading into the unknown.
It's a very strong parallel, but the question is, what did they find when they got there? Was the land just empty?
The answer is complex, right?
Yeah.
Because of the Infocane.
Absolutely critical context. The Emphicane or Difficane was this period of intense warfare and disruption in the early 19th century, largely driven by Zulu expansion under leaders like Shaka.
And it was devastating.
Hugely. Some estimates suggest maybe 1 million people died or were displaced. Entire regions were depopulated or saw their social structures shattered.
So when the Boer Voortrekkers, the pioneers, sent scouts inland,
They found a mixed picture. Some areas were still inhabited, definitely, but other large areas were relatively empty, or certainly less populated than they might have been because of the Emphicane's effects.
so it wasn't a simple case of walking into unoccupied land, but it also wasn't densely populated everywhere they went.
Exactly. It wasn't a blank slate, but the context of the Emphicane is crucial to understanding land availability at that specific time. Again, much more complex than just land theft.
Right. It's this convergence European expansion meeting the aftershocks of massive internal African conflict. And the Voortrekkers' interactions with the tribes they did encounter were varied too.
Yes. The source mentions both cooperation treaties, trade, but also significant conflict. Clashes with groups like the Indabella under Mzilikazi, and particularly with the Zulus.
Which brings us to the Battle of Blood River.
A hugely significant event in Afrikaner history and identity, 1838. A few hundred Voortrekkers against a Zulu army estimated at maybe 12,000.
And the Voortrekkers made a vow beforehand.
Yes. Led by Cyril Cilliers, they vowed to build a church and honor the day if God granted them victory.
And they won, unexpectedly.
Dramatically so. According to the accounts, no Voortrekker deaths, while maybe 3,000 Zulus were killed. It became a cornerstone of their identity.
How so?
It cemented, or at least deeply reinforced, their sense of being a chosen people, their conservatism, their religious conviction, and their connection to the land they felt they'd fought for under divine providence.
And after that, Boer settlement pushed further north.
Yes, eventually leading to the founding of republics like the Transvaal and the Orange Free State and cities like Pretoria.
Okay, so fast forward through the next century or so. Populations grow significantly, both black and white communities.
Right, leading to South Africa's roughly 60 million people today.
And the demographics now are roughly, what did the source say? Just under 5 million white people.
Yeah, including about 2.7 million who identify as Afrikaners. Then there's a larger colored or mixed race community, many of whom also speak Afrikaans. And of course, the majority black African population, itself diverse with many different ethnic groups.
Understanding those demographics is key. Now, this brings us towards the 20th century and, inevitably, apartheid. The term genocide gets used sometimes in relation to this period, but the source addresses that directly.
It does. And it's crucial, while acknowledging how utterly unjust and damaging apartheid was, never minimizing that to use terms accurately.
The source argues genocide, meaning systematic extermination, doesn't fit the demographic facts.
Correct. The black population actually doubled in the early decades of apartheid and kept growing substantially. This isn't to defend apartheid at all. It was horrific oppression. But genocide has a specific meaning that, according to Rowitz, doesn't apply here based purely on population numbers.
Okay, so what was the initial idea behind apartheid, according to the source? Not the later justifications, but the concept.
The initial concept, as presented, was this idea of separate development, creating distinct homelands, or Bantustans, for different black ethnic nations, alongside white South Africa, all under a strong central government.
Kind of like a forced top-down version of separate European nations.
That was the flawed analogy used. But the source points out the massive impracticality and inherent injustice of trying to impose this separation with a single, powerful central government controlling everything. It was doomed to fail.
And this is all happening against the backdrop of the Cold War too, right?
Absolutely. That context is vital.
Mhm.
The apartheid government used the threat of communism, both internally and internationally, as a major justification for its policies and repression.
But eventually, even within the Afrikaner establishment, there was a realization it couldn't last.
By the 1980s, yes. The source mentions that feeling of riding on the back of a tiger. It was unsustainable economically, socially, internationally.
Which led to the transition in the early 90s. And that transition, considering the decades of oppression, was relatively peaceful overall.
Remarkably so, in many ways. Nelson Mandela's leadership in pushing for reconciliation was obviously absolutely central to that.
But the source adds a nuance often missed.
Yes, it highlights that while the high-level political transition was managed relatively peacefully, there was actually a huge amount of violence happening on the ground, particularly within black townships. Black-on-black violence, often politically motivated between different factions, that tends to get underestimated in the narrative.
And just to clarify for listeners, townships were and still are these often impoverished, densely populated urban areas on the outskirts of cities where most black South Africans lived under apartheid, and many still do.
Precisely. So, post-apartheid, the African National Congress, the ANC, comes to power, and their stated goals are broadly socialist.
Yes, including significant emphasis on things like land reform, property rights, wealth redistribution, addressing the massive inequalities left by apartheid.
Which are undeniably huge. But the source raises a caution here about framing the primary problem solely as inequality.
What's the distinction being made?
It's the danger of focusing only on redistribution without equally focusing on, say, job creation and growing the overall economic pie. Tackling unemployment and boosting production might be just as, if not more, critical than simply dividing existing wealth, which might not be sustainable.
There's that analogy used, the cost of innovation is inequality.
Right, suggesting that in any dynamic, growing economy, some level of inequality might naturally emerge initially as new wealth is created before things potentially even out. Now, that's not to excuse extreme inequality.
Which South Africa definitely has.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the source links that extreme disparity from an anthropological view to potential increases in violence, particularly among young men feeling disenfranchised.
And that kind of deep inequality also makes it easier for politicians to exploit grievances, doesn't it?
Very easy. Pointing fingers. Those people over there have what should be yours. Scapegoating becomes a powerful tool.
We also see, according to the source, a growing influence of more hardline communist ideas in the political discourse.
Yes, adding another layer. And all this culminates in what the source describes using that stark metaphor. The ship is sinking.
Meaning massive state failure.
Pretty much across the board, it's not just about the type of policies, though. The source is critical of some radical leftist ideas being proposed, but more fundamentally about the state's capacity to actually implement anything effectively.
Due to.
Primarily, pervasive corruption and widespread incompetence, as argued in the source material.
Yeah, the examples given are quite shocking. Let's run through some.
The power grid. Chronic failures, rolling blackouts, load shedding, for hours every day, sometimes up to 10, 12 hours. Lack of maintenance, failure to build new capacity for decades.
Water.
Huge losses.
Yeah.
Maybe 50% of municipal water lost through leaks. Poor infrastructure. And the source mentions this tendency to blame old apartheid-era pipes instead of current mismanagement.
Okay. Transport.
Railway systems have largely collapsed. The port of Durban, once a major hub, ranked basically last globally for efficiency in a recent report.
Roads.
Similar story, lack of maintenance leading to deterioration.
Policing. This one is striking.
The private security industry is now apparently double the size of the official police service and the army combined.
Wow. What does that lead to?
Well, for those who can afford it, private security. For those who can't, especially in poorer communities, it can lead to informal, sometimes brutal vigilante justice because the state police are seen as ineffective or corrupt.
And education.
A really bleak picture. The source claims something like 80% of state schools are dysfunctional. Massive disparities between the few functional, often former Model C or private schools, and the majority where basic learning isn't even happening effectively.
It's a grim list.
It really is. Leading to that cynical observation from an economist mentioned in the source, the best investment in South Africa. Find a failing government service and create a private alternative.
That says a lot. And the source suggests this trajectory, while maybe faster in South Africa, could hold lessons or warnings for Western countries too.
Yeah, the idea that some of the underlying issues may be related to governance, social division, economic pressures might be present elsewhere, just developing more slowly. A kind of canary in the coal mine scenario.
Okay, now let's shift to something particularly contentious highlighted in the source, the slogan, "Kill the Boer." Dr. Rowaite's book title itself forces you to confront it.
And his core point is that we should take what people say, especially political leaders and their chants, seriously. Don't just dismiss it as rhetoric or metaphor.
He argues people generally do what they say they intend to do.
Broadly, yes. Or at least that such statements reveal a dangerous underlying intent. The anecdote shared about farm attackers being caught, and then a radio report downplaying the kill the Boer chant as just metaphorical. That contrast is stark.
It highlights a disconnect, definitely. And Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, is central here.
He's the most prominent figure associated with leading this chant at political rallies.
And the justification sometimes given is that it's about the historical struggle against apartheid.
That's one justification offered, but Malema himself, as the source points out, has also said the struggle isn't over, which makes the chant feel very present tense.
And the rhetoric goes beyond that single phrase, doesn't it? The source lists other examples.
Yes, deeply disturbing things attributed to Malema or his party, like talk of slitting the throat of whiteness, saying all white people are criminals and should be treated as such, explicit calls to go and take land without compensation.
It sounds like classic dehumanization tactics.
Exactly. Calling opponents or targeted groups cockroaches, white filth, this taps into his disgust. And the source makes a crucial psychological point. Disgust doesn't just lead to fear, it often leads to a desire to eradicate, to cleanse.
And we've seen where that kind of language leads historically.
Tragically, yes. Nazi Germany, Rwanda. The parallels in the type of dehumanizing language used are impossible to ignore, according to the source.
There was even a court case about the chant.
Yes, and Malema's testimony, as reported in the source, was chilling. He apparently said something like, "We are not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now."
At least for now.
And then reportedly went on to say he couldn't guarantee the future, that he might call for it one day, and if that happened, it would be white people's own fault. It's placing the potential for future violence squarely on the target group.
That's incredibly alarming. It feels like laying groundwork.
Yeah. It certainly echoes historical patterns. And the source also discusses the reaction when people, particularly Afrikaner groups or those highlighting farm murders, try to speak out against this rhetoric or the violence.
They face backlash.
Often vicious backlash, accusations of racism, of being kafir-fearing, of trying to portray all black people as violent.
It ties into that concept mentioned, the oppression Olympics.
Yeah, this toxic dynamic where acknowledging the victimhood or suffering of one group, in this case white farmers facing attacks, is seen as somehow denying or minimizing the historical suffering of another group, Black South Africans under apartheid. It makes it politically difficult to even discuss certain realities.
Because it disrupts the simple narrative of oppressor versus oppressed.
Exactly. It complicates that narrative. And the source argues this stems from a flawed assumption that if a group has been historically oppressed, they are therefore incapable of contemporary wrongdoing, prejudice, or inciting violence themselves.
Which is obviously a dangerous oversimplification of human behavior. Any group is capable of criminality or hate.
Precisely. Ignoring that potential, the source warns, is incredibly dangerous and blinds people to real threats.
So, given all this,
Yeah.
state failure, divisive rhetoric, violence, what about the future? What solutions does the source touch upon?
Well, it mentions past international attention, like President Trump commenting on farm expropriation and murders, and the South African government's immediate denial that there was any major problem.
That highlights the sensitivity.
Hugely. The idea of refugee status for farmers or Afrikaners is touched on, but also the concern that mass emigration would lead to cultural dissolution.
So emigration isn't seen as a primary solution.
Not necessarily a desirable one. The focus seems to shift towards more fundamental internal restructuring. The source uses the term dispensational solution.
Meaning more than just changing the ruling party.
Yes. The argument is that the problems might be too deep, too structural for just a change in leadership within the current system. Given the country's size, diversity, the legacy of a strong central government, and what the source sees as a tendency towards socialist policies that struggle in poorer nations,
A different structure might be needed.
some form of significant decentralization of power seems to be the core idea presented.
Like the comparison made to Europe.
Yeah, less like a single unitary state trying to impose one identity, and more like a collection of distinct nations or regions with more autonomy. Perhaps a federation, maybe even separate states. Eventually the term balkanization is even floated, though that's obviously looted.
So more power closer to the ground. A bottom-up approach.
That seems to be the idea. Letting different communities have more say in their own governance, respecting existing cultural and ethnic identities rather than trying to force an artificial national unity. The relationship between EU member states and the central EU body is offered as a kind of analogy.
And this links to the issue of traditional leaders, too.
Yes, the source mentions that the current government sometimes dismisses strong cultural or ethnic identities as backwards tribal thinking, rather than recognizing them as legitimate forms of social organization for many people.
So ultimately, the goal of suggesting these kinds of radical changes is
What? According to the source, it's about finding a structure that can actually function, and most urgently avoid the looming possibilities of mass violence, state collapse, and even starvation, which are presented as very real risks on the current path.
wow. Okay. So wrapping this up, this deep dive, using the Rhodes transcript and related ideas really hammers home the complexity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The South Africa that emerges from these sources is just so far removed from any simple black and white narrative. The history is tangled, the present is precarious.
Yeah, those layers of settlement, the Mvekine's impact, the specific evolution of apartheid and now state decay, extreme inequality, and this incredibly dangerous rhetoric. It's a potent mix.
It really is a
Yeah.
deeply concerning picture.
And it definitely leaves you, our listener, with a lot to mull over. Thinking about that historical weight, the very real dangers highlighted in the source, the hate speech, the failing state capacity.
It really forces you to grapple with some tough questions.
Like, how do societies navigate these incredibly deep divisions, cultural, political, economic things, especially when the institutions meant to manage them are crumbling?
And are there lessons here, maybe warnings from the South African experience for other diverse nations facing their own stresses and fault lines?
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
Definitely a situation that warrants ongoing attention and, crucially, a willingness to look beyond the easy narratives and engage with the difficult details from all sides.
Couldn't agree more. Impeccable evaluation of information is key.